the room to light up outside as opposed to here. The idea being that it was a sacred ritual, and God didn't need to light it up. There's also the dedication of the Levites, and that subject. I think we talked about it previously about initially the Bechor, the firstborn, were supposed to be the ones doing the service, and then it transitioned, and it's never 100% explicitly clear what happened, but there's different indications suggesting that, especially around the time of the golden calf, the Levium, the Levites, did not give in to the temptation of the golden calf and idol worship, and so they kind of earned it as opposed to the firstborn. There's also a connection to the last of the 10 plagues and different things like that. But the one that I decided to focus on is Pesach Sheni, because I love this theme, and I think it's a theme that we need to be reminded of constantly. The idea of redemption, the idea that no matter what happens, if we're willing, we can rededicate ourselves. So I found this nice Sefaria sheet that I thought would be a good kind of jumping off point, and we'll see how it goes from there. Before we start, any thoughts about Pesach Sheni? Does everybody know what Pesach Sheni is? Does anybody not know what Pesach Sheni is?
I don't know what it is.
All right, perfect. So Pesach is Pesach, right? And Sheni means second. So as we'll read, unlike any other Jewish holiday, certainly unlike any Jewish biblical holiday, if you weren't able, and again, how to define legitimately, but if you weren't able to observe, come to the temple and do your sacrifice on the regular date of Passover, you were given a second chance. All right, so let's just jump right into the text. Vayidabra Moshe el Bnei Yisrael La'aseh HaPesach. I'll just go straight to the English here. Moses instructed the Israelites to offer the Passover sacrifice, and they offered the Passover sacrifice in the first month on the 14th day of the month at twilight in the wilderness of Sinai. Right, that's the regular Passover. Just as the Lord had commanded Moses, so the Israelites did. But there were some men who were unclean by reason of a corpse, right, coming in contact with a dead person, and could not offer the Passover sacrifice on that day. Appearing that same day before Moses and Aaron, those men said to them, "Unclean though we are by reason of a corpse, why must we be debarred from presenting the Lord's offering at its set time with the rest of the Israelites?" Right? So that can be seen as chutzpah. You're going to challenge Moses, you're going to challenge God. Who do you think you are? Right? Or it could be seen as a genuine desire to do the right thing, but they just couldn't. And it's not that they're challenging or being chutzpah. They're just saying, is there any concession here? Is there any dispensation? Moses said to them, "Stand by, and let me hear what instructions the Lord gives about you." Does this remind anybody of any other circumstances where people came to Moses and said, why, can we have a concession? Why don't we get something?
I think this is Jack. Was it had to do with women's inheritance?
Exactly. Exactly. You want to expand on that?
I think it was some daughters who they were just daughters, and the father died, and they weren't allowed to inherit. I don't remember the details, but I think you actually mentioned that once.
Exactly.
The daughters couldn't inherit.
Exactly. The story is known as the Daughters of Zelophehad. It's 4 syllables. And they essentially, there were no sons, and they advocated for inheritance, and a similar thing happened. Moses said, good question, and brings it to God, and they actually were successful in their claim. Right, so there's certainly exceptions to the rule, but it at least opens up the possibility that there's some flexibility. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the Israelite people, saying, when any of you or of your posterity who are defiled by a corpse, or hold that thought for 1 second. That's my grocery order. So remember, the people who came to him were the ones that were defiled by a corpse. But over here, God actually expands it. Any of you or of your posterity who are defiled by a corpse or are on a long journey would offer a Passover sacrifice to the Lord. Basically, they weren't able to get there on time. They shall offer it in the 2nd month on the 14th day of the month at twilight. Right? Same thing, just a month ahead. They shall eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. They shall not leave any of it over until morning. They shall not break a bone of it. They shall offer it in strict accord with the law of the Passover sacrifice. But if a man who is clean and not on a journey refrains from offering the Passover sacrifice, that person should be cut off from his kin, for he did not present the Lord's offering at its set time. That man shall bear his guilt. Right, so there's a little bit of a mixed message here. On the one hand, there's a concession. On the other hand, it's saying, if you do this on purpose, it's not going to fly. And when a stranger who resides with you would offer a Passover sacrifice to the Lord, he must offer it in accordance with the rules and rites of the Passover sacrifice. I will be back in one more second. I'm sorry again. All right, thank you. All right. There shall be one law for you, whether stranger or citizen of the country. Right, and that's certainly a nice message when we're in a time when there's so much focus on discrimination. There shall be one law for you, whether stranger or citizen of the country. Right? All right. So this is a quote from Rabbi Ismar Shorsh. This page was compiled by Deanna Neal, who I don't know, but I looked her up, and she's a conservative. I'm not sure if she's actually an ordained rabbi or not, but pretty highly accomplished Jewish educator in California. The passage reveals a striking exception. No similar concession is granted for missing any other festival. There's no second chance for those who, for some valid reason, are unable to observe Sukkot or Yom Kippur. Right? You would have the same problem, for example, being disqualified from going into the temple if you came in contact with a dead person for Sukkot and Yom Kippur. The added dimension of Passover seems to be its thoroughly national character. It commemorates the founding of ancient Israel as God's emissary to humanity. Right? So the argument here is that the reason that there's an exception with this holiday is because it's not just a personal holiday, although one could argue those other holidays aren't completely personal either. Right, on Yom Kippur, there was the sacrifice for everybody. On Sukkot, it was also a celebration of the Exodus, being in the wilderness. But this one in particular has that character. Each time that the nation was reconstituted by Joshua, Chizkiah, Josiah, and Ezra after an exile, the occasion was marked by a public celebration of the Passover festival. The import of Pesach Sheni seems to be the integration of the individual into the religious polity. To sacrifice the Paschal Lamb was to reaffirm one's sense of belonging. Hence the possibility of a second chance, right? And the ritual of the Korban Pesach, the Passover sacrifice, was communal in nature because one person couldn't eat the whole animal. Or at least, I don't know, maybe in the Coney Island hot dog competition somebody could, but normal people couldn't. And often a family unit couldn't. Probably all, unless they were like in Borough Park and they had 21 kids. And so you had to include other families. And the reason you had to do that is not just because you didn't have a freezer, but because there was an obligation to complete it. You couldn't leave it over to the next day. All right. The import of Pesach Sheni seems to be the integration. Okay, I said that. Annually, everyone had to avow and renew the bonds of national affiliation. Now, this comes from Sometimes There Are Second Chances, from Rabbi Yisrael Short. Sifrei Bamidbar, the Sifri. This is one of the commentators. And he says, when it says, Ezra, B'chol Mitzvah Shabbat Torah, when it says that there's only one law for you and for what was the quote? There should be one law for you, whether stranger or citizen of the country. Hence do I derive the same for all mitzvot of the Torah. From one statute shall there be for you, both for the proselyte and for the native of the land. Scripture hereby equates the proselyte with the native in respect to all the mitzvot of the Torah, right? Now, this can be tricky because depending on how you define proselyte, when it says ger, it often doesn't separate out between somebody who's a resident versus somebody who's converting. So it can be a little bit tricky. All right, Chizkuni. Chizkuni is a commonly quoted commentator because he often has a different take on things that are often more relatable. Oil b'derech rechoka, or on a journey far off. Right, it's a very interesting phrasing, the way it's put. It could just say, or being very distant, or on a journey far off. There is a dot on the letter Hey. You can't see it here because of the font. In the word rechoka, this dot is not connected to the word baderech, or if so, the word would be treated as if it had not appeared. Rather, that dot connects to the word ish, a man or a person. We are to understand the person concerned as being spiritually on a journey that had estranged him to Judaism and its God. I'm not entirely sure what he's saying with this, because depending on how you see dots in the Torah, So there's some words that you might notice when we have services in person, if you're reading a Chumash, that have dots on top of them. And I've talked about this before. And there's different understandings of what those dots mean. One understanding is scholars have seen it in other Near Eastern languages and manuscripts as well, and it seems to indicate that was a way, they didn't have any erasers, and that was a way of saying this should be deleted. This was put in here by accident or whatever. Others see it as emphasis, which is essentially the opposite. But either way, the point that Kiskuni is making, and that we also see in the Talmud Yerushalmi, unlike the Babylonian Talmud, is that they see this as a metaphor. They don't see it as literally, being too many kilometers or miles away, but being spiritually away. Another quote from Kiskuni, O L'Dura Sechem, right? It says, for you or for the generations to come. The verse means that the person described is either at this time far from you spiritually or time-wise. In other words, if many years from now there will be someone who, due to the time that elapsed since the Exodus, feels disconnected to our history and therefore would not observe the Passover ritual by having his heart in it. Again, emphasizing the point of the metaphor, which makes it a lot more relatable, right? Because we're not offering an animal sacrifice. So for the most part, this holiday, it's like, sure, it's nice, but it doesn't have a whole lot to do with us. But if it's meant as a metaphor, as is being suggested, then it takes on a whole new meaning, right? I think it's a bit of a stretch. Obviously, not obviously, but it seems like it was literal and it's a metaphor. Anyway, so now we have another quote. This one coming from the book Pesach Sheni, The Holiday of Second Chances by Karen Wolfers Rappaport. What does being contaminated by death and a traveling on a distant road have to do with us? Right? Again, the idea of being defiled, impure, is a spiritual concept that has to do with the temple and the sacrifices. And since we don't have the temple, we're not offering sacrifices, that whole concept, other than for a Kohen, where it's still applied that they're not supposed to, for instance, be in a building with a dead corpse, and there's restrictions about going to the cemetery and things like that, that's still observed to this day. All the other laws of ritual impurity are pretty much don't apply. There is still the mikvah, but in terms of the temple, part of it certainly don't. So what does being contaminated by death and traveling on a distant road have to do with us? These terms point to a deeper concept. A state of disconnection from God is a type of death. All right, so let's read that one again. That's a pretty powerful statement. A state of disconnection from God is a type of death. A distant road is placed where we are far away from who we really are supposed to be. Right, so this is kind of a psychological, spiritual concept. This is something most of us can identify with. When we are influenced by death, in quotes, when we are traversing along a distant road cut off from our truth and our source, we have the power to change directions and come home. How? by accessing this unbelievable gift of second chances. Right? The famous example is, of course, Rabbi Akiva, who went from being seemingly ignorant in Torah to becoming one of the greatest scholars. But on an individual level, we're supposed to, not just on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, but on a regular basis, be doing an inventory and asking ourselves, am I on the right track? And, what can I do if I'm not? What can I do to correct course? Right? The word chet, the word that we use in Judaism for sin, more literally means to go off, like to go off the path, off the mark. And so it's not so much a question of somebody being good or bad, although there's certainly elements of that, as much as being on the beam or off the beam. And if you're off the beam, then you're headed towards a ditch on the side of the road. And so the challenge is to correct course. In the second Pesach account, the Torah shows a preference for the acceptance and understanding of human reality over and above the perfect and pristine performance of ritual duties. Right? And this quote here reminded me of, in a previous class we talked about this perfectionism that's required when it comes to the sacrifices and when it comes to the Kohanim, right? Where they couldn't have a blemish and it had to be, young and, all these things that seem to indicate that we were aiming for this kind of perfection. Did anybody else lose the presentation, or is it just me?
No, I lost it too.
All right, let me see what's going on here.
I lost it also, but then my whole tablet restarted.
Not sure what's going on, but let me just re-project. Every time I say the word project, I think of the psychological term of projection.
It came back.
What's that?
It came back.
Yes, excellent. Thank you. Right. So this concept of Pesach Sheni kind of counterbalances this idea of perfection in ritual. And it says that, there's also a reality and things don't always line up. And we have the ability to advocate. And that's the key message that I hear from this. We don't necessarily have a Moses that we can go to who can go directly to God and confirm or deny our request. Having that certainty would be nice. And so we're left with having to make our best guess, go to somebody who's knowledgeable. But the concept of just because the rule is so doesn't mean it has to be so. And there may be some wiggle room. There may be some flexibility. Is something that I think we can all relate to. Indeed, the Torah became the bedrock of Judaism, not so much by assertion as by ritual. The synagogue developed into the national theater in which scripture and liturgy converged to reenact weekly the awesome transmission of Torah at Sinai. But if you think about it, the main event when going to shul is the reading of the Torah, right? You could daven at home. Yes, there's also community, but at least the what's being performed is a sort of mini reenactment of the giving of the Torah at Sinai. Every aspect of the ritual was meant to convey the numinous quality of the original drama. The diffusion of theology requires ritual. Modern Jews are at risk not because they have lost their faith, but because they have lost their appreciation for ritual. It's a powerful quote. I'm not sure if it's how well it fits exactly with what we're saying here. I don't know that I would have used it on this sheet, but I think that in part because on the one hand, the Pesach Sheni is a ritual, right? It's giving you another opportunity for the ritual. On the other hand, the message is not so much about ritual, it's more about process. And so you have both of these at the same time. Practically speaking, in my hospice work, this is one of the biggest challenges that I deal with for people, especially people who are not religiously connected and willing to follow traditional ritual. So I often have questions about, and this is true for everybody, but, within the Jewish realm of, what's Shiva? I mean, one of the stories that I often tell that kind of reinforces this for me, and I'm sorry for those that have already heard it. I'll give it the summarized version of it. When I was doing hospice work in Staten Island, I got a call about a woman who wanted a traditional Jewish funeral and wanted to know if I can help. I said, sure, I'll be happy to help. So I got to the house, and it was this big Italian family. And they immediately started telling me what they had in mind. An open casket, flowers, basically everything except a traditional Jewish funeral. And, I said, this is wonderful, but you do understand that this is not a traditional Jewish funeral. Anyway, the story of the negotiation is another story. But the point is, at least in that case, they wanted to do ritual. They had ritual, except it wasn't Jewish ritual that they wanted to do as much as ritual. But when people don't have ritual at all, it's much harder to be able to get through something, because then you have to be in your head and you have to try to figure it all out. And then there are times for figuring it out, and there are times for following. And at a time of immediate grief and mourning, it's a time for following. You don't have the bandwidth to figure it out. And in general, when it comes to life, and I've talked about this before, we operate on habit more than figuring it out. And if we have to figure everything out all the time, we would be paralyzed. And so ritual allows us to be able to operate. This happens, we know how to deal with it. We know how to deal with it as individuals. We know how to deal with it as a community. There are exceptions, like we see here with the Pesach Sheni. Sometimes things don't go according to plan, but at least there needs to be a plan to be able to focus. And people who are not religious, and we see this, a lot of therapists work hard to help people develop rituals so that they can get through different periods in their life.
Could I just add something?
Yes, of course.
I'm a big admirer of Rabbi Shore. She used to be I'm sure you know this, the head of United Synagogue or JTS? JTS. Right. And I would read his writings every week. He's really, to me, a forward thinker. And I agree with what he's saying, because theology in itself is rather abstract. As specific as you can make it, It's still in our heads. Whereas diffusing is his word into ritual, to me means that it makes it concrete. It supports connection.
Yeah.
As well as the comfort. So it makes a lot of sense to me. And I think modern Jews are at risk, not because they've lost their faith. I think most Jews would say, oh, yeah, I believe Judaism is being a good person. I mean, how often have we all heard that one?
Right.
It's a ritual which puts it in the context of the theology. So.
But what connection do you make with Pesach Sheni for it?
I would go back to the fact that people didn't have the original concept, that people didn't have the ability to get there in time.
Right.
That's really all it means to me.
So making sure that they have another opportunity to practice the ritual.
Exactly.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And then continuing along this idea of what's most important in Judaism. We talked about the Aseret Dibra last week. I think it was last week. How do you kind of boil down Judaism into steps or into principles or statements of? And so this is another way of looking at it, because it's such a big body of information. Of thousands of commentators and books, and it's just overwhelming. So sometimes it helps, and you see this, in the Aseret Dibra, in Maimonides, in, for example, Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of Our Fathers, which is traditional to read during this time. So here's another example of an attempt at it, more than an attempt. An actual example. The five-legged table. According to Abraham Infeld, there are 5 components or legs that combine to make up a person's Jewish identity. And I think this is the same one that's in that pamphlet about kind of defining what it means to be a conservative Jew. So memory, not history per se, but memory. The family story that teaches us and links us to a collective past. Right? It's very easy to get caught up in, how much of the Bible is complete, 100% historically accurate or not. And that's certainly a worthwhile endeavor from an intellectual exercise. And at the same time, we could, even if we don't come to the conclusion that it's all historically accurate, we can still see it as our family legend, as our family story. And that in itself is powerful. It's our collective past. Family. Judaism is not a religion, again, not a religion per se, but a big family you're born or adopted into. One large, diverse family with a common lineage, traditions, and language passed through generations, right? And just like we were just saying, and these are expressed through ritual, whether it's gefilte fish or korban pesach. The ritual is this. The idea of ritual is the same. This is what we do. Covenant, as established at Mount Sinai, it entails A, to recognize one God, B, to make the world a better place for all people, C, to use certain rituals to define and shape Jewish time and space. I might have added circumcision to this because often when it uses the term covenant, it's actually referring to circumcision, that was the way the covenant was marked. Israel, the Jewish memory warehouse and place where the Jewish future is being written, right? And that's something that, every time I hear people saying, that Israel is the Ashkenazim came to, conquer the Palestinians after the Holocaust and all of that. And, the Jews have no claim to the land from before that. And, all you have to do is daven and read, and you see how many times Israel and Jerusalem are in the liturgy. And throughout Jewish history, we never gave up that yearning and that the belief of returning. Even in our most sacred and joyous occasions, we always insert it, including the tradition by many at a wedding to sing Im Eshkachech Yerushalayim, if I forget you, O Jerusalem, or the tradition in a new home to leave one wall or the corner of a mirror, something imperfect, the same way you might, have during a Shiva, some way of marking that we're in mourning, acknowledging that without us having Israel, and depending on how people's theology about that, we are still in mourning.
Rabbi, Shelley Blackman, I have a question.
Hey, Shelley.
So under covenant B, to make the world a better place, where was that established? And it says, as established at Mount Sinai. I understand how Tikkun Olam is an important part of modern Jewish theology, but how was that established at Mount Sinai?
Well, it kind of goes back to the question of what was established at Mount Sinai, right? Was it the 10 utterances, the 10 commandments?
Mm-hmm.
Was it the 5 books? Was it was Isaiah there, right? I think a big part of the Tikkun Olam theology comes from Isaiah. The sort of broader message. So I'm assuming they're taking it from the broader belief that all of Torah, depending on how you define that, was given there. Because certainly in the 10 Commandments, it's much more focused internally.
Yeah, it's much more a nationalistic approach.
Exactly. That did catch my attention as well.
Yeah.
Good call. Hebrew, the means of transmitting culture to the next generation, right? And this is, it's interesting in terms of what was allowed to be translated to Aramaic and what wasn't. And, for example, we just saw on Shavuot that, with the Akdamot and the introduction to the Akdamot, we learned that they would recite a verse in Hebrew and then recite the translation in Aramaic, right? Or the Kaddish and some of the other really important aspects of Jewish liturgy are in Aramaic, and somehow they've become holy in Aramaic when all it was a translation, right? It was the language of the time. But even with that, Hebrew managed to keep a foothold as the main language, and regardless of throughout time when things were translated and it was either used more or less, it was still the language, right? So you have Ladino, you have Yiddish, and you have other different languages that came and went, but Hebrew hung in there as our language. Choosing at least 3 of the components of Jewish identity or legs provides a stable platform for living a Jewish life. Three legs of a table is not super stable, but I guess it can stand. And contributing to the world. Less than 3 and your table or platform of Jewish identity will topple over. More than 3, it makes it more sturdy. Choosing 3 also means that every Jew shares at least something with every other Jew, even though they may look different and have very different lifestyles, cultures, and customs. Despite the difference in Jewish expression, Jews share some of these elements through the way they build their own identities. Which legs make up the foundation of your Jewish identity? I think this is really important, and we certainly see it in our congregation, that there are people that have a strong emphasis on one over the other, and that's the main aspect of their Judaism. It's interesting that Torah is not one of these five. It's certainly kind of interlaced in it, but not on its own. But for a lot of people, Israel is really a rallying cry, and an important part. Family for a lot of other people. I guess covenant kind of includes Torah, and yeah. So that's this sheet. Any other questions or comments or concerns, stories, hopes? So I think the question that we can ask ourselves with all of this is, what is our Pesach Sheni? What aspect in our life do we fall short in? And then the question becomes, do we just say, you know what, I'll throw my hands up because it's hopeless anyway, I haven't been doing this for years, or I have been doing this wrong for years, or whatever it is, and that's it? Or do we say, hey, let me see if I can negotiate with this? Is there any bargaining room? Just as the people who were defiled with engaging with a person who had died, or the people who were too far away, however you define that, is there room, for instance, to say, maybe it's the letter of the law is too difficult for me, but is there something in the spirit of the law that I can do, or vice versa?
Well, I have a comment about that, because I've always been perplexed from learning that if you don't count the Omer every night, it's like don't bother anymore. Yeah. That never made sense to me. Why, if you missed a night, so okay, you try not to miss it, but why wouldn't you continue the counting?
So it comes from the idea that it's a continuation, right? And so you're counting, you're marking these days from one to the other, and if you haven't been doing it consistently, then you're kind of marking it, but you're not marking it consistently. And the mitzvah is to count it consistently. That's the simple explanation.
Right.
But I hear you. I think it is hard, because it does kind of send the opposite message of, if you didn't do this perfectly, don't bother.
Don't bother, right.
Right. Having said that, you still have the mitzvah to count the Omer, just not to say the blessing.
Right.
Right. So it's, but yeah, it can certainly be off-putting.
Yeah, and it's really the only tradition, or it's not a commandment. So what would you call it? A ritual that is termed like that. If you don't do it complete, don't bother doing it.
Well, yes and no, right? Because there are time-bound mitzvot that if you don't do it within a certain time, then you either can't say the blessing, or you can't even do it.
Mm.
Right? So for Hanukkah, for example, you're supposed to light it the night before. If you light it the next day, some people would say, don't say a blessing. just light it. You can still light you can say the blessing for the next night. But, for example, the morning service, at some point, you missed it, you don't repeat it.
True, but you're not told don't bother with the next morning service. Although, anyways, that's always bothered me.
Yeah, I hear you.
Yeah.
All right, so that's our class for today. Everybody's invited to the stepping up ceremony that's going to be at 11. It's not on this link. There's a separate Zoom link that was sent out. And I look forward to seeing everybody. I assume we're on for next Sunday. I don't know of any reason not.
Do you know what time, Rabbi?
I think we're going to go back to 11. Let me just look at the calendar and see if there's anything.
Right. There's no more Hebrew school, so keep that in mind.
Yeah. So today.
You want to continue at 11.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. I have the Hebrew school thing on the 14th. I guess originally it was on the 14th. All right. Maybe that's why I'm confused. We're back to 11 next week.
Thank you.
You got it.
Okay. And, of course, tomorrow at 7:30.
Yeah, services tomorrow at 7:30 and Thursday evening at 7:30 as well.
Right.
And there's a board meeting as well for those that...
Right. Wednesday at 7:30.
Yeah. All right. Take care, everybody.
All right. Yashikoa.
Okay, bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
My pleasure. Bye.
Bye-bye.